Hi, everybody. Thanks for sharing. I hope you can hear me. Please let me know if you can. I've been doing a lot of sound experimentation. Okay, there's some echo in the audio. Thank you. I'll be done sharing in a moment. Okay, I'm joining you on the main page now. I tried to adjust for the echo. Let me know how I've done. Hello, Doctor. Alana says there's some echo. And Russ says echo in the audio. Steve says, is there a doctor in the house? Steve says, share. There's at least one doctor in the house. That's me, but not that kind of doctor. I'm a political science doctor. Rob says, hey Yoda. Hey Rob. Lana, Rob, and Steve have joined. Bonnie's joined. And Elaine LaForbes has joined. Yeah, Joe Firestone, PhD. Steve says, still echoing. Okay. So let me try the medicine which should stop the echoing. Okay, tell me now, did I stop the echo? Huh? Still an echo? How about now? Rob says no more echo. Rob says it's perfect. Okay, thanks. Okay, I'll answer the question. What are my thoughts on that? I thought I did give some thoughts. Okay, my thoughts on that are that, yes, the superdelegates will try to elect someone other than Bernie. Steve says increase the volume a bit. Okay. Okay, Steve, let me know how now. So I made some comments, and okay, my comments basically were that they would try to nominate someone other than Bernie, but that I did not think the 776 of them or 772 of them would operate completely as a block. They might operate 6-1 in favor of the alternative. They might operate 5-1 in favor of the alternative. But I don't think they'd be truly a unanimous block. So I think if Bernie is close enough to a majority, even if it goes to a second round, he still may win. Also, a lot depends on the context. The context, okay, of the convention and what's going on in the world and what's going on outside and what's happening with the party and what's happening with the movement. Okay. If the movement is very, very strong at that time, and they can all see it, and if the opinion polls are telling them that there's likely to be a total split in the party, if they continue to try to take it away from Bernie, then that may cause some of them to cross over and vote for Bernie, even though they would rather not actually do that. So I think it's hard to predict what the outcome of that is going to be. It all depends on the context of their going to the second round. Okay. In other words, if Bernie stops at, say, 1,400 delegates or 1,500 delegates or even 1,600 delegates, and he still has something like 390 to go, then I think they will try to nominate a centrist, and they'll have a very good chance. Okay, let me turn it up a little bit more. I can do that. Okay, how's that? How's the volume now? Is it better? Okay, if he comes up with only 1600, 600, 1650, 1700, that may be problematic. If he comes up with 1800 delegates, though, that may work just fine. Okay, Kay, is there still a problem with my volume? Elaine says yes, better. Rob says volume is way better. Okay? Yes, thank you, Joe. Okay. Steve says Michael Bloomberg is paying 150 to support him, okay, on Instagram. POC preferred. Pete is paying $50 to attend his rallies, POC preferred. It's a gig economy. And Russ says volume is okay, but there is a white noise too. We can tolerate it. I'm not sure how to partial the white noise out. I'm afraid. Not sure exactly what's causing that. It could be something as simple as the fan in my computer, which I can do very little about. Anyway, so that's what I think. It's dependent on the context, Rob. Okay, yeah, I wish there were no superdelegates also. Not even in the second round, but there is. And Rob says that white noise is the fan of the computer. I'm afraid I need that fan. I have an i7 chip. It's a 4th generation i7 chip, and they run rather hot. Rather hot, they do. Okay, let's get into the subject matter more deeply for tonight. Okay, there was an article which appeared in Truthout. Now I'm going to switch my scenes now, so you can see the article, or you will be able to see the article anyway as soon as I change scenery here, as well as my scene. But then, please tell me whether the sound is still good. And I'll try to debug this again for next time. Okay, so here I am again. I'm back. You should be able to hear me again. Okay, an article appeared in Truthout. The title of it was Democrats are stumped over how to undo Republican takeover of federal courts. The Democrats are always stumped about things that can be done. It's not that the things can't be done, it's just that the solutions are unacceptable to them. This article was written by Jessica Mason. I guess her last name is Pieklo or Piccolo. Hard to know how she pronounces it. It was published in Truthout on February 11, 2020. With the help of the Republicans in the Senate and the Federalist Society, Donald Trump is transforming the judiciary. Of course, we all know that, right? In the first 3 years of his presidency, he's appointed nearly 200 ideologues, most of them young white men, to lifetime judgeships on the bench. This has created a political crisis for Democrats, one for which they have no clear plan. That was the takeaway Saturday at the conclusion of the first ever presidential forum dedicated to the federal courts. Our Rights, Our Courts, quote unquote, was hosted by a group of New Hampshire civic leaders and was sponsored by a variety of interest groups that are mentioned in the article. I'm not going to read them. They are progressive groups. And it brought together several Democratic presidential candidates. Mayor Buttigieg, Senator Sanders, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Warren, and Senator Bennett, along with billionaire activist Tom Steyer and entrepreneur Andrew Yang. They all participated in the event. The candidates agreed on Saturday that the conservative capture of the federal courts is a big problem for Democrats. Do tell, huh? Do tell. And they were afraid, of course, that new policies by progressives could be stymied by Trump's federal judges. But no candidate seemed to have any idea of what to do about it. Now, I'm sure Sanders has some idea, of what to do about it. He's smart enough to have an idea, of what to do about it. But essentially, let me tell you what to do about it, Well, here, they did say, that Buttigieg and Yang and Sanders all offered structural changes, which are designed to temper the effect of the Supreme Court appointments, such as expanding the number of seats on the courts or ending lifetime appointments. Again, Klobuchar has proposed requiring Supreme Court justices be bound by ethics rules. I'm laughing, because in our government, in these days, in this day and time, nobody is bound by ethics rules. It's purely individual. It's purely voluntary. We wouldn't be in the trouble we were in if people were bound by ethics rules. And Warren made a compelling case to center the federal courts as an electoral issue. Well, centering the federal courts as an electoral issue is fine. No problem with that. But it seems to me clear that structural changes have to be made. Specifically, what I would propose is that if 200 young conservatives were appointed by Trump to federal seats, and they all, are ideologues, and most of them are young white men to lifetime positions on the bench, then the obvious remedy is for the Congress to expand the judiciary by 200 people, most of them non-white women, and also men, who are of a decidedly progressive disposition, to lifetime spots on the bench in order to restore the balance. Restore the balance. That's the way you restore the balance. Similarly, the Supreme Court should be expanded to 15 people. and new appointments should be quickly made by a new president. And these appointments should pass a litmus test, more than one, specified by progressives. So the majority is taken away. Now, there are various ways to structure this. Perhaps it shouldn't be 6. But to my mind, Republican finagling with the presidency and with the judicial appointments and with elections have resulted in the appointment of John Roberts and Sam Alito, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh most recently. So that at least 4 out of the 5-4 majority the Republicans have at this point are there due to finagling. They are there due to finagling. So at least 4 more seats should be created by the Democrats in order to compensate for the finagling. You might ask, what did Roberts and Alito have to do with any finagling? I remember the finagling of the year 2000, when the Supreme Court, on a partisan basis, basically gave the presidency to George Bush, when Al Gore had more votes in Florida, as it turned out, and should have won the presidency. That was finagling. That resulted in the appointments of John Roberts and Sam Alito. I want those seats back. Or at least I want them to be neutralized. I also want the Gorsuch and Kavanaugh seats to be neutralized. And I also think that there should be a couple of extra seats that ought to be thrown in as a warning against any further finagling, building up the court to 15 seats and making sure that there's a substantial majority for progressive decision-making on the court, so that so many ruinous decisions by the Supreme Court in this century can be easily reversed. Call the extra 2 seats essentially punitive damages. I don't care what you call them. But I'm saying, don't start now to construct a fair system, because it's not a fair system without compensatory damages. And that amounts to those 6 extra seats. So I know what to do. That's my proposal. I hope that Bernie does it. Now, I know that there's going to be a disposition on the part of the Republicans to pay back as soon as they get control again. But I have confidence that if Bernie's whole program is passed, they're not going to get control again for at least 20 years. I don't see the party of death who is marching towards climate extinction getting back into the presidency again for 20 years if Bernie's agenda passes. I don't even know if that party is going to survive. There are other things that could be done. For example, it is clear to me that at least the following Republican appointees to the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, Sam Alito, Kavanaugh, and Gorsuch, all lied to the Senate in order to facilitate their confirmations to the Supreme Court. I'm sure Kavanaugh and Thomas lied, and I think there's very good evidence that Sam Alito and Neil Gorsuch also lied. So another thing that could be done is to impeach the four of them. But that might be more contentious than just appointing new justices to the court, expanding the court, and appointing new justices to the court. The article states, the answers given by the candidates in the forum, or by the participants in the forum, like the answers to how the candidates would fix the courts, failed to grasp the severity of the crisis in front of us. Codifying the Roe v. Wade decision in law does nothing to roll back forced waiting periods, insurance coverage restrictions for abortion care, and the hundreds of other abortion restrictions already in place across the United States. Funding Planned Parenthood does nothing to ensure that abortion care is affordable, let alone support independent abortion providers. No, but after all, Medicare for All would see to it that abortion care is affordable. That is, a Medicare for All that doesn't include the Hyde Amendment in it would see to that. I'm sure that is Bernie's plan. As pointed out in the article, Trump campaigned on a promise to appoint judges intent on overturning Roe. He's made good on that promise. He has. He's made good on that promise. That's why, one of the main reasons why we have to restore the balance. And the article says we're nothing short of a constitutional crisis when it comes to abortion rights, one made possible by the conservative takeover of the federal courts. I certainly agree. I certainly agree. Might not be just a constitutional crisis. I mean, it might really precipitate a revolution. Passions can run very, very high over the abortion issue, as we all know. Taking it into the public sphere has been a terrible mistake. The author is in favor of making the federal courts an electoral issue. What I'd say is, as long as Bernie is doing well and seems to be winning, don't make it an electoral issue. Because it's a divisive issue. It's not an economic but class issue All it can do is inflame people and create a cleavage in the party. Right now, the party has to solve problems, of inequality, has to solve the Medicare for All problem, which, by the way, would solve the abortion rights problem also. And, of course, it has to solve the climate emergency and the problem of a just transition. So, anyway, I'm going to leave that article now. It's a very good article. I commend it to you. I've linked to it. You ought to read it, because it's clear on what's coming. But I don't think it should be an electoral issue as long as Bernie is ahead and running for president. So I think he'll take care of it once he gets in. February 8th, 2010. Article published in Common Dreams by Ryan Cooper. Originally appeared in The Week, which is Ryan's home base for writing. The article is entitled American Democracy is Dying. Yeah, we can see it happening right before us. And he goes through the week just before he wrote this article, which once again was dated February 8th. So it was the first week in February he was talking about. He called it a litany of disasters. First, on Monday, the Iowa Democratic Party catastrophically botched its caucus. Right. And the Nevada Democratic Party is preparing now to botch its caucus, isn't it? To have its caucus deluged with legal challenges. Second, on Wednesday, President Donald Trump was acquitted in the Senate impeachment trial. Well, that's been coming for a long time, because Nancy Pelosi refused to impeach on the full book that could have been thrown at Trump, because she didn't think we could impeach the president and do other things at the same time. Meanwhile, we've been impeaching this president, and there's been a presidential campaign going on perfectly well, thank you, except for the final 10 days when some of the senators were imprisoned in Washington so they could be at the trial. But my point is, if Nancy Pelosi had thrown the book at Trump, it might have taken another 3 or 4 months to throw the book at him. The presidential race would probably have been in a lull by then, and the chance of having a conviction would have been much, much greater. Second, on Wednesday, President Donald Trump was acquitted. Sorry, I read that already. Anyway, every Democrat voted to convict, and of course every Republican, except for Mitt, voted to acquit. And lastly, what's more, we learned about the attempt of a Wall Street billionaire, Michael Bloomberg, to straight up buy the Democratic nomination. Has a real possibility of success as he rockets past Mayor Pete in national polls. Right. Of course, he's not just a billionaire. He's a 60 billionaire. I wish people wouldn't keep glossing over the distinction between Tom Steyer, who's probably only got $1.7 billion, and somebody else who's got 30 times that amount of wealth. That's a big difference, folks. Anyway, Ryan goes on and says that a nakedly corrupt president who blatantly tried to rig the 2020 election now has full license to try the same trick again, and the Democratic Party has proven itself incapable of carrying out elementary electoral procedures every democratic nation mastered decades, if not centuries, ago. That was true, but in those nations, they were evidently not always engaged in trying to cheat certain candidates in the party that were not part of an establishment. So yes, they mastered the art of counting votes a long time ago, even when they were paper ballots. And by all accounts, in most nations, they did it fairly honestly, though it was always true in the United States that there was a problem. For example, the 1960 election was probably swung to Kennedy through Mayor Daley cheating in Chicago, essentially manufacturing a lot of votes from dead people. And of course, there was periodic cheating in our elections going back a long time. We have an ignoble tradition of cheating when it comes to elections. Don't forget all the cheating in many states of the Union in order to prevent the black citizens from voting. That went on for years and years and years. And that, after all, was election rigging. In other words, the white Southerners did that because during the Reconstruction period, there were blacks who were winning elections and serving in office. And the white folks down there didn't like that. So they sabotaged the electoral process. Going on, the impeachment trial result was always a foregone conclusion given the cancerous infestation of corruption and screeching propaganda that infests the Republican Party. That is why, and others argued that what the Democrats should have done would have been to use the process to uncover as much of the corruption of Donald Trump and his abuse of power as possible, particularly his violently unconstitutional looting of public money into his own pockets. At least Democrats could use subpoenas to reveal what Trump is doing in great detail and at great length if they weren't able to get him out of office. Cooper's dead on about that. But you know how I feel about that. Anyway, it goes into Pelosi's actions. And points out it left out the clearest instance of the corruption of Donald Trump and put the Democrats in the uncomfortable position of appearing to defend Hunter Biden's genuinely corrupt buck-raking off his father's position as vice president, as well as explicitly defending imperialist misadventures in Eastern Europe as noble protection of U.S. national security. So Ryan goes on after some more comments and says, one must conclude the impeachment mechanism basically does not work. We are right now living James Madison's worst nightmare, a nakedly corrupt demagogue who's plainly incapable of discharging the duties of the presidency. He's now sitting in the White House, and when the constitutional method of removing him was tried, it could not get even a majority in the Senate, let alone the 2/3 majority necessary. Now, as Duncan Black points out, if Obama had done even half of what Trump has, Democrats almost certainly would have supported his impeachment and removal from office, because that party is not nearly as corrupt or brain poisoned by partisan media. But a mechanism to remove a corrupt president that only functions when used against a party that is far less likely to be corrupt in the first place can't be said to work in a reliable way. Yes, absolutely correct there, Ryan. And then Ryan goes on to talk about the American constitutional structure as being far too brittle and unwieldy. He points out that the worst president in American history, Andrew Johnson, I don't know, Ryan, Trump might be the worst president in American history, escaped being removed from office by a single vote after being impeached. What's more, a major reason why Trump got off is because the U.S. constitutional system has gradually funneled more and more power to the executive. The framers of the Constitution hated political parties, feared tyranny by the state, and tried to design Congress and the presidency as checks on each other in order to prevent those eventualities. The idea was that each branch of government would jealously guard its power and thus stymie the mischiefs of faction, quote unquote. But it turns out that political parties are vitally necessary to the functioning of any democracy, well, certainly any representative democracy, and partisan loyalty can easily trump any checks and balances motivation. If different parties control different branches of government, the parties are polarized. Instead of compromise, the legislative process breaks down. This problem was previously dodged when the two parties both had liberal and conservative wings, hence making compromise easier. But as they have become ideologically coherent, with a conservative GOP and a liberal left Democratic Party, compromise gets harder and harder. Yes, but at least it's more possible for the people to decide on either one path or the other. So in some ways, the path we've taken promises in the end to be a more democratic path than the type of party system that we had before. However, the public does have to make up its mind. And I think that in the coming election, Senator Sanders can help the public, help us all to do that. Ryan says, but any nation still requires government, and with Congress hamstrung most of the time, power flows to the executive and the courts. And that's exactly what has happened. And Ryan Cooper asks the predictable questions. With Trump in office and able to do what he wants, what abuses might he try next to keep himself in office? Question mark. Instructing Attorney General Barr to open a fake investigation into whoever wins the primary in the Democratic Party in late October, or hacking his opponent's campaign's emails and dribbling out the most inflammatory private messages over a period of months, straight up simply rigging the vote count, the possibilities are limitless. In short, the United States has a galloping case of authoritarian rot, in large part because the fundamental ideas motivating the Constitution are poles apart from how people actually behave. It's a political document drafted by people obsessed with putting limits on government power, and that has fueled a tyrannical, unaccountable president. And then Ryan moves to the primary in the Democratic Party. And so the party was in the first stages of picking the nominee of the party, who will contest the only method still remaining for turfing Trump out of office, namely the election. And at the very first contest, the party face-planted in unprecedented fashion botching the caucus worse than it has ever been botched. Now, why is that? Why is that, folks? Well, Ryan doesn't really discuss that, but it's obvious the reason why that occurred is because the supposedly more liberal Democratic Party, the more liberal and left party, is not really very liberal, okay, or very left. It has a progressive wing, which is much more left. But the majority of people still in office, still in power in that particular party, are not left. And that party is divided in a kind of civil war where the establishment in power is using every trick in the book to stay in power. The question is, what abuses of power will that establishment engage in to head off the person who is obviously the choice of the people, specifically Bernie Sanders, who has the best net approval rating going right now, and who has had that for a long time? Well, that's Bernie Sanders. His approvals vastly outweigh the disapprovals. Why isn't the party going for him? Because the elites, the establishment in that party, hate the base. Bernie represents the base. The elites have become corrupt and divorced from the progressive base of the party. That's why Iowa failed. That's why the party face-planted. Because the elites were trying to cheat and back the candidate they wanted. And Ryan goes through what caused the immediate problem, the party electing to use a phone app. Perhaps we should say what they elected to use was a phony app to report the results that had been slapped together in a matter of weeks, had severe security flaws, and had not even been given a full test before the day it was used. And by the way, Nevada is opting right now for tools, they say. And the tools that they're talking about have also not been tested in this kind of application. And they're being slapped together in a matter of weeks since the failure, of Iowa. It's being slapped together in what? In a little more than 2 weeks. Supposedly it's being tested now, though. The tools are. So have to see what happens. Anyway, Ryan goes on in more detail about what happened there in Iowa. And recites the facts, as we now know them. Then he gets to Bloomberg. And the billionaire has funded his campaign with $200 million of his personal fortune as of a week ago. Oops, sorry, it's up to, what is it up to now? 370 or 350? I think it was 350 million. In an article that appeared about the same time as Ryan's, maybe a little bit later. A gigantic sum for a presidential primary, but only a tiny fraction of his estimated $58 billion fortune. So, yeah, Ryan points out correctly, it's inconceivable that Bloomberg could be a Democratic presidential contender without his money. This is a guy who was a Republican until 2007, well into his 60s. who endorsed George Bush in 2004 and thanked him at the Republican National Convention for starting the Iraq War, who has numerous sealed sexual harassment lawsuit settlements, and who reportedly plagiarized huge chunks of his 2020 campaign platform. And it's not even the first time that he's bought an election. In 2008, he spent big to overturn New York City's term limits law so he could get a third term as mayor. And he bought off the billionaire who had originally pushed for limits by promising him a seat on a powerful city board. Then he spent a further $102 million to win the ensuing election. As my colleague Damon Linker argues, Mayor Bloomberg is without question a Russia-style oligarch. There's that word again, MSNBC. There's that word again, oligarch, whose campaign is, quote, an expression of highly developed rot at the core of the American political system. Indeed. If Trump is undermining faith and trust in American democracy from the top down, Democratic Party is undermining it from the bottom up. And the corrosive concentration of wealth in the billionaire class is dissolving it from the inside. But we Americans often boast that the U.S. is the world's oldest democracy. I'm quoting now from Ryan. It's a dubious claim, but it is true that the U.S. Constitution has been in continuous operation longer than any other. What we see is the sclerosis of age. It says the founders made a decent effort for the 1780s, but constitutional design has come a long way in 240 years. American-style separation of powers has proven far inferior to European-style parliamentary systems. Well, maybe so, but they ain't doing that well in the UK. Just to point out something. And literally every other country that followed the American model saw their democratic institutions collapse into dictatorship or revolution. Indeed, when U.S. occupation forces set up governments in Germany and Japan after the Second World War, they did not copy the American model. Gee, we did not copy the American model. We had more sense than to do that after the Second World War. Ryan says, I see two basic paths forward for the United States. Either a crusading reformist president and Congress breathe new life into the American system with a major overhaul of both its structure and economy, or a right-wing or oligarch president finishes coring out the few remaining elements of Republican government and buries the American Constitution for good, auguring in a Napoleon-style period of overtly authoritarian rule. And given the absolute shambles the Democratic opposition has made of the 2020 campaign so far, not to mention the strong economy buttressing Trump's support, I would not remotely count out the latter possibility. The end of American democracy would be a disaster, of course, but it may not last long. Dictatorships tend to be unstable, unless they are incompetent, corrupt, and because they are incompetent, corrupt, and tend to suffer succession crises. But Vladimir Putin has kept a grip on power in Russia for over 2 decades. However, Napoleon lasted less than 16 years from the coup of the 18th Brumaire in 1799. Goes without saying that Trump is no Putin, much less a Napoleon. Yes, but he has a very, very, very powerful army. Now, Napoleon had one too, of course, but only the equal, not the superior, of the rest of Europe, whereas one could argue that we have an army, or at least a military, sufficiently powerful to destroy the whole world if the authoritarian in charge is crazy enough. At any rate, all this is to say we live in dangerous times. A lot of history may well happen very quickly in the next few years. Patriotic Americans should work to the utmost to defend our democracy, but failing that, we should also be prepared to rebuild it from the ground up. About every other country has suffered a constitutional collapse at some point. Our number may well be up quite soon. A timely warning from Ryan Cooper that I really wanted to cover here in the worst way, because there is a lot of truth to that. A lot of truth to it. We're fighting hard now. We got to keep fighting. We got to keep fighting for a Sanders administration, but it's not just for a Sanders administration. We've got to keep fighting to build the movement that will motivate that administration. As Bernie likes to say, it's not me, it's us. We got to build us into a powerful force that cannot be contained by the billionaires, by their institutions, by their spending. We've got to do it. So now we come to a number of pieces, on Bernie, that I'm going to go through very, very quickly. One appeared in Truth Dig, called What's Driving Democrats Bernie or Bust Freak Out, and it was by Jacob Bacharach. And Bacharach, who's well known in liberal circles for a very, 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 very long time, goes through the history of this the campaign and the defeats of all the people the establishment has put up thus far to try to win from Bernie, and from the progressive wing, and he includes Warren, in the progressive wing, but I'm not so sure. Of course, their efforts are still continuing. But what had become clear, however, was that just as a fractious field on the Republican side had failed to coalesce around an establishment figure in 2016, aiding or at least permitting the victory of Donald Trump, so too would the presence of so many Democratic candidates redound to Bernie's advantage. And he points out that so many Clintonites have convinced themselves that Sanders is some kind of communist Donald Trump or a brooding Stalin to Trump's febrile Hitler, only makes their fear all the more visceral. Well, he's right about that. I mean, did you see that Chris Matthews antics this past week? I mean, the man is... his head is exploding. Anyway, he talks about that conflict that's going on. And he says, into this fracas have swaggered several Twitter personalities, most notably the socialist lawyer and think tanker Matthew Brunig. Yeah, Matt Brunig. And the host of the popular leftist podcast, Chapo Trap House. Full disclosure, one of the podcast hosts and founders, Will Menaker, was my book editor, and I consider him a friend. I have been a guest on the show several times. Turning the logic of unity so often deployed against them by Clinton supporters, they argued that if it was the duty of Democrats to line up behind the most electable candidate to achieve their own preferences of policy and personality in order to defeat Donald Trump, then it was necessary, obligatory, for all Democrats to support one Bernard Sanders. If Sanders' diehards are the one unmovable block within the party, they reasoned, then a good portion of them were guaranteed to stay home if he doesn't get the nomination. Only by joining them could nervous Democrats cement the full party coalition and prevail. Turnabout is fair play, right? This argument began, I think, as an only half-earnest provocation, a dare to the many voices in professional Democratic circles who preached unity so long as it aligned with their own preferred choices, but who reacted with incredulous rage if you suggested that it was they, not you, who might have to hold their noses and back a guy they didn't really like. But over the months, perhaps because of the outraged reaction it engendered among a cadre of former Clinton backers, it solidified into something more like an article of faith, and later a battle cry of the Sanders supporting online left. Certainly is one of my battle cries right now. It's time they got behind the obvious choice, the burn, long past time. This message makes people very, very angry. It is sabotage, it's blackmail, it's misogyny, it's juvenile petulance. It is the privilege of non-immigrants and white people who, if they have suffered at all under Donald Trump, have not suffered enough and would inflict him again on the poor and the vulnerable simply because they could not have their way. It is purity politics. It's unrealistic. It isn't fair. It's bomb-throwing. It's masturbatory. It's disrespectful. It is impudent and insolent for these nobodies, these outsiders, these jokers, who have never consulted on a campaign or designed a media strategy or jockeyed for a West Wing job to run a think tank. Although Brunig has in fact done at least to the last to make demands from a position of, let's be honest, some negotiating strength. But the real source of the anger this Bernie or bust rhetoric engenders is rooted in a few specific kinds of incomprehension among lifelong Democrats broadly and professional Democrats specifically. First and foremost, they view politics transactionally. Candidates are a product to be created, packaged, and sold to consumers, you the voter. Second, trained by a party apparatus that has been flinching since George McGovern's defeat in 1972. They can't understand a candidate who is actively trying to win rather than avoid losing, who is willing to say, fuck it, I might win and I might lose, but I'm going to do my damnedest to enact my program. Third, and most critically, they're absolutely flummoxed by a political movement based on an actual positive commitment to a governing agenda rather than a negative commitment simply to stop Donald Trump. In other words, a movement that views defeating Trump as a necessary precondition but not an end in itself. So Bacharach says, now, I am admittedly a Sanders supporter. Representation matters. And I think it is high time we have somebody in the White House who looks like me, i.e. a weird, ungainly Jew who talks with his hands and whose spouse has to tell him to keep his voice down in restaurants. And I might add, when he's live streaming. I'm not perhaps as devoted as his most ardent backers. In other words, I'm not precisely the kind of wobbly voter they're warning you about. I feel more warmly than most Sanders supporters towards Senator Warren, even after her unnecessary and ill-considered attempt to smear him as a sexist. But Jacob, she's been smearing him ever since. That was only the first of the smears. I mean, the latest was today. But he goes on, I think I could vote for her with mild regret. After all she's done, I really don't know. I really don't have any faith in her as a progressive at all. It appears to me if she could campaign in the way she has, to me that means we can't trust a thing that she says. Knowing that the system can't be defeated at the ballot box and hoping that she has a sufficient amount of Gorbachev in her, to steer us through a Soviet-style collapse. I don't think Gorbachev steered Russia. He might have steered us through that, but he didn't steer Russia through that. I mean, Russia collapsed. Its population fell. Population of Russia fell during the dark times of the 90s until Putin took over. It fell to 130 million people. I mean, the apparent records suggest 40 million people in the Russian Federation died due to the transition. Because Gorbachev wasn't there to steer them through the transition. He had to get out, and it was Yeltsin, the drunk, who did the steering. And who turned over the country to the neoliberal gangsters. I might even be persuaded to vote for Amy Klobuchar if she were the nominee. If nothing else, she has proven she'd be willing to channel Lyndon Johnson and bully members of the Senate in increasingly florid ways. But she's a neoliberal to the core, Jacob. She's a neoliberal. She's not going to solve any of the problems. And he says, the rest of them. I suspect I'd probably stay home. Never have I seen such a collection of weirdos, billionaires, and careerist dweebs without the slightest indication of a core moral code of a common sense of humanity, says Jacob. Okay, so you get the drift of this, okay, I think. I won't go any further through it, except to end actually in the last part he begins to talk about the consultant class and what they would lose if Sanders were to win. He talks about all the technocrats within the party that would passively resist the Sanders agenda, taking every occasion to play Herman Melville's famous fictional character Bartleby, who replies to every request from his employers with, quote, "I would prefer not to," unquote. But without a line to the White House, and I'm finishing now, it's still very possible that the consultant class would grow less but lucrative, and that an alliance of up-and-coming, media-savvy, and policy-oriented policymakers from Rashida Tlaib to Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez to Katie Porter to Ayanna Pressley, don't forget Ilhan Omar, please, and Ro Khanna and Pramila Jayapal and Ro Khanna will give Sanders a popular and quotable base of support in the legislature that will move the party, whether it prefers it or not. And that's the way he ends, on a little bit of a hopeful note. I like a lot of what he said in this article, but some of his instincts are not mine, like Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren, God. Amy Klobuchar, God. Forks in the salads. Forks to comb hair. What is it? Combs in the salads. That's what it was. Combs in the salads. Okay. In New Hampshire. Article by Michael Corcoran in Truth Out on February 11th. New Hampshire proved that the Medicare for All argument is still powerful for primary voters. And that was arguably, in great part, responsible for Bernie's victory. He says it's no surprise that Medicare for All advocacy has fueled much of the energy behind Sanders, whose viability as a national candidate has given advocates for a single-payer healthcare system a major voice in the national debate for the first time in a generation. I think it's for the first time in 2 generations. Got to go back a long way. It was almost on the table in 2009, of course. But I mean, I think you have to go back to the 70s, really. Anyway, he quotes James Haslam, Director of Rights and Democracy, a New Hampshire-based organization aimed at countering the influence of money in politics, who said, quote, people in New Hampshire are really sick of having to deal with such an ugly healthcare system, a system that is about providing profits to corporations at the expense of the working class and the poor. This is what is energizing many people in New Hampshire around the Bernie Sanders campaign. It's about his message that healthcare is a human right. And then he goes on in this article to describe the crisis in New Hampshire. I'm not going to go through that with you. You can read the link. Okay, I've given you the link and you can read it. It's a very, very convincing argument. Things are a mess in New Hampshire. People are suffering due to the lack of a Medicare for All system. He goes through the administrative savings that can be gotten from a Medicare for All program, mentions those anyway, points out they do not exist in public option plans, such as in Pete's, in his, I almost don't want to say it, the Medicare for All who want it plan, which is not Medicare for All, of course. This distinction matters to many voters. And he seems to think that Medicare for All's winning argument is that it's going to save money over the status quo when all factors are taken into account. And then he argues incorrectly. He thinks it's a winning argument. What he says is, when Joe Biden and others attack Medicare for All on cost, they often cite the number $32 trillion. What they fail to mention is that this number is the cost of single-payer health care over a 10-year period and is $2 trillion less than what would be spent under the status quo. And, of course, he refers to the Mercatus Institute, and he refers to Peary also, saying that that Peary, which is the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, shows greater saving, as do the case studies across the world. But what he doesn't mention is that even taking that $32 trillion as the likely cost of Medicare for All over 10 years, which is highly, highly arguable, it might well come down even to $25 trillion, maybe $7 trillion under than that $32 trillion. It is clear, absolutely clear, that we're looking at 50 to 60 trillion if we go with the status quo, or if we go with the Buttigieg type of program. When we look at total costs, when we look at what national health expenditures are going to be, he fails to make that argument. So yes, it's a winning argument, but you got to make it right. You have to look at the total costs. We're at $3.8 trillion now without Medicare for All. Without Medicare for All. If it didn't go up a penny, and of course it has to increase simply as a result of inflation, but if it didn't go up a penny, the cost over 10 years will still be $38 trillion for the status quo. So even on that silly basis, it would still be $6 trillion more. $4 trillion more in savings than Corcoran is very loosely estimating here. But of course, it's not going to stay the same. Its costs would probably increase at the same level they've been increasing for the last 10 years, when they've gone up from something like total spending of something like 2.5 trillion to 3.8 trillion. Anyway, the projections from the Center for Medicare Services itself, from CMS itself, are that staying on the present track, okay, or going along with a public option or something like that, is going to end up costing us $50 trillion. And the Brookings Institution says it's going to be $60 trillion. So, total health care spending, okay, under Medicare for All, it's probably going to save 50%. I'm betting 50%. Okay, a little more bit of news. Sanders crushed Trump by 18 points among independent voters in a new national general election poll. All I wanted to do was mention this. It was a Reuters Ipsos poll. It was released, okay, on Monday. It's now Thursday, of course. Found Bernie Sanders leading President Trump by 18 points among independent voters in a hypothetical general election matchup. And Bernie's argument: get the independent voters out. Get them out to vote. They're 42%. 42% of potential voters right now. 43% of potential voters. The parties, I think, are down around 28% right now and 26%. If all those independents showed up, Sanders would start out with an 18-point advantage. That would be narrowed a little by the party voters, somewhat. And we're talking about a landslide for Bernie Sanders here in the coming election. According to the new survey, Sanders has the support of 46% of registered independent voters, while Trump polled at 28% among the independents. He's weak among the independents. Weak. He wasn't the only one, by the way. Warren polled 5 points higher than Trump, 34 to 29. Okay, and Buttigieg, 35 to 27. Bloomberg, 39 to 25, plus 14. Even Biden, plus 14. But Sanders was plus 18. Sanders wins the electability argument again in this poll. He wins the electability argument. As things stand now with the polls, he is more electable. And if you think the socialism charge is going to get him, you're crazy. He knows how to get by that easily. He's been doing it for so long. All he does is say, look, this is what I mean by socialist. This is what I mean. And then he puts forward his whole agenda. Then he says, do you like this? Do you like this? That's what I mean by socialism. Do you like it? I mean, you can call it whatever the hell you want. If you like it, you'll vote for it. The word socialism isn't going to scare you. I mean, the communists have been gone for a long time now, folks. A long time. Only the 70-year-olds like Chris Matthews still wonder if they're going to be taken out and executed in Central Park. Jeez. What a nut. What a ninny. Anyway, the next article appeared in The Intercept. It's by Aida Chavez and Li Feng, and it's about Sanders going to Nevada and looking to the workers there, while the Vegas union bosses rally against him, specifically the culinary workers union bosses. But Sanders has a lot of grassroots support among the culinary workers. And there are going to be a lot of people coming in from California to door knock for Bernie. The ground game is going to be very, very strong in Nevada. And a lot of those union people are going to be coming out for Bernie and not for the culinary union. Of course, the argument is going to be about whether Bernie's going to take away their hard-won health care. And they're going to make that argument. And then Sanders is going to have to argue against that. And of course, Bernie has already answered that charge. In Common Dreams, there's an article on February 13, 2020. Sanders argues that Medicare for All is vital for union workers. He says they're losing wage increases because cost of health care is soaring. That's the title of an article by Jake Johnson, the staff writer over at Common Dreams. I've linked to the article, of course. And Bernie made the case for why achieving single payer is so vital for union workers and everyone else in the United States. And boy, the nurses are going to be out there in force, going union member to union member, talking to the culinary union workers, trying to swing as many of them as they can. Bernie said many, many unions throughout this country, including some in Unite here, and the culinary union is part of that organization, absolutely understand that we've got to move to Medicare for all. And the reason is, if you talk to the negotiators, they will tell you they spend half of their time arguing against cutbacks for the health care that they have. They're losing wages because the cost of health care is soaring. When everybody in America has comprehensive health care, when we join the rest of the industrialized world by guaranteeing health care to all people, unions can then begin to negotiate for higher wages, better working conditions, better pensions. So, I think the future for unions is through Medicare for all, unquote. That was Bernie Sanders. When asked about the situation there by Chris Hayes, Bernie Sanders said, "My response is that I have a lot more union support than Mayor Buttigieg has, or I think ever will have." And there's a little video there where he's saying that. However, the culinary union echoed the common criticism that that a Medicare for All Act would end union health care in its new flyers. Then they doubled down on the criticism in the face of the backlash, claiming Medicare for All would, quote, take away the system of care we have built over 8 decades. They're afraid for their jobs. Union leaders and members, I'm talking about the heads of the unions, the union leaders and members supporting Medicare for All have repeatedly pushed back against that line of attack. Quote, I really resent the 16 million workers who joined together and bargained for better health plans being pitted against millions of Americans struggling to get health care coverage, unquote. And that was a quote from the SCIU president, who's Mary Kay Henry, last August. And according to Labor for Single Payer, 19 unions representing nearly 10 million workers across the U.S. have endorsed Representative Pramila Jayapal's Medicare for All Act of 2019, the act that I favor most of all. In response to Buttigieg's tweet on Wednesday touting his own Medicare for All Who Want It public option plan, Sarah Nelson, president of the Association of Flight Attendants, accused the former South Bend mayor of perpetuating a gross myth. Sarah Nelson is a firebrand. Not every union member has union health care plans that protect them, she tweeted. Those that do have it have to fight like hell to keep it. If you believe in labor, then you'd understand that injury to one is an injury to all. She also said, this is offensive and dangerous, before she sobbed, stop perpetuating this gross myth. She tweeted that at Mayor Pete. And HuffPost's Jameson reported on Wednesday, quote, the culinary membership itself is almost certainly divided on the issue of Medicare for All, which would virtually eliminate private insurance and provide comprehensive care to everyone in the United States for free at the point of service. And he adds further that Bernie's proposal would require the company's savings from passage of a Medicare for All bill be used to increase workers' wages and pension benefits. So the Senate's proposal is going to write that into law. So they'll get the superior Medicare for All benefits, and they'll also get an increase in their wages and pension benefits. Now that's a better deal if I ever heard one. Sanders faced some tough questions on Medicare for All and some heckling when he spoke before union members in Las Vegas in December. But the Las Vegas Review-Journal, Jameson said, reported that he otherwise enjoyed an enthusiastic reception with the crowd, firmly behind Sanders and chanting, Bernie, Bernie, at times. The union has not yet endorsed a 2020 presidential candidate. I think the culinary union is scared to endorse because if it does endorse, it may be alienating a large part of their membership. And it may result in the loss of jobs for the people who are heading the union right now. Sal Rosselli, president of the National Union of Healthcare Workers, which endorsed Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, told HuffPost that, quote, over the years, members sacrificed wage and other economic increases to achieve employer-paid health care for them and their families. Now, every contract cycle is a fight to maintain it. And by the way, it's a losing fight. It's a losing fight. Whereas Medicare for All is a fight they can win right now and have the benefits for good, forever, and go bargain for other things. It makes them so much freer to fight. Quote, from Rosselli again. With Medicare for All would take health care off the bargaining table so improvements could be made to pensions, wages, training, child and elder care, and other economic issues, he said. So, final piece of news related to Bernie and to Bloomberg and to what's coming. As of today, Thursday, February 13th, on Common Dreams, Ocasio-Cortez rips Bloomberg on stop and frisk. Quote, just a billionaire trying to cover up authoritarian and racist policy, unquote. Another article from Jake Johnson. and I can go through this very quickly. Alexandria said on Thursday that Bloomberg is, quote, just a billionaire trying to cover up authoritarian and racist policy. If he does not commit to providing relief to those ensnared by the racist stop and frisk policy he supported as mayor of New York City. And she asks, will people get their records expunged? Will young people sucked into the spiderweb of incarceration get their lives back? She asked on Twitter in response to a Bloomberg article about its owner's efforts to move past his record on stop and frisk, which has received renewed scrutiny in recent days. And she said, quote, unless there is restorative justice, there is no moving on from stop and frisk, unquote, added Ocasio-Cortez, who endorsed Senator Bernie Sanders in the 2020 Democratic race. In replying to herself, she said, New York City is about 60% people of color. Stop and frisk was an unconstitutional, devastating practice for the entire city that intentionally exempted white people from harm. It was one of the most racist policies I've ever lived through that deeply impacted the entire city. Ocasio-Cortez's comments came days after progressive radio host Ben Dixon posted to Twitter an audio clip of a 2015 speech in which Bloomberg defended stop and frisk as necessary less than 5 years ago and dismissed its harms as, quote, unintended consequences, unquote. Unintended consequences screwing people in New York City far and wide. And Benjamin Dixon said, share this far and wide. Unless the mainstream media picks it up, it will be isolated to Twitter. After the clip went viral, Bloomberg issued a statement distancing himself from his past comments on stop and frisk. This issue, and my comments about it, do not reflect my commitment to criminal justice reform and racial equity. It strikes me, just a proposal on my part. It strikes me that one thing that Bloomberg could do is to compensate all the people he sent to prison for the pain and suffering they endured while there by dipping into his fortune of $60 billion and using that to begin to redress their grievances, to begin to supply some restorative justice. If he would dig into his fortune for that purpose, rather than for trying to spend hundreds of millions to stop Bernie Sanders, from winning elections, maybe we could believe that he really regretted his mistakes of the past. Ocasio-Cortez herself told reporters Wednesday that she found his statement woefully inadequate. She said, quote, I think quite a few things happened under him as mayor. Frankly, we all know stop and frisk. That was my family. That was my community. That was my neighborhood. And we know this was a policy that decimated a lot of families, unquote. I say, let him pay back for the decimation. And then, if he still wants to, maybe it would make some sense for him to run for president. Who knows? He might even retain a few billion to run with. God. It's disgusting when you think about it. Bloomberg is disgusting when you think about it. Somebody who's done such evil. Oh, and by the way, a topic we'll take up here next time on Saturday. Right now, Buttigieg is being touted as Mr. Austerity. But really, it's Bloomberg who's been Mr. Austerity for years and years and years. He's been working hand in glove with the Peterson Foundation forever. He echoes the ideology of the Fiscal Times. He was instrumental in the founding and support for the No Labels Group, which is a group of people committed to imposing austerity on the United States virtually forever. On that note, I will turn to your comments. Thank you for your patience. Okay, I don't think I'm going to have to refresh my page. I see people are saying good night now. I think my page just refreshed. I'll begin to consider all the comments. Well, Antonio Calhow is here and says, "Ho, Joseph M. Firestone. Ho, Antonio Calhow." Okay, Antonio is greeting us from Spain. And Russ says Chris Matthews is in meltdown. And Steve says 20 watching. Keep sharing. Thank you, Steve. And Kay Ryan says, Ari Melber. Yeah, it's Melber with an ER at the end, Kay, rather than an AR. What did Ari say? I think Ari's a good guy, but he doesn't want to give up the MSNBC paycheck. Put up a pic with Matthews and his group and commented on it that I used to watch his show, but not anymore since he has Matthews and too many others like him on there. Got several likes on that comment, too. And Rosemary... there's a Rosemary who has joined, but my scrolling skipped past her. And Joanne Rocadio has joined. Hi, Joanne. Rosemary Robertson joined. Hi, Rosemary. And hi, Dolores. I know you're here because you were here at the beginning. Kay says FDR wanted it in the 40s too. And Steve said JFK advocated for Medicare for all back in 62. He did. He did. He did. JFK was all for it. And Johnson was for it too. But he thought it wasn't feasible in after he won in 1964. So he compromised. His compromise, was Medicare. He intended to pass that and then to push through over a period of years extensions to other ages, so eventually everyone would be on Medicare for all. Okay? But of course he had to retire early because of it was part of the cost that was paid for the Vietnam War. Johnson would have been a far better president if he had avoided any further involvement, in the Vietnam War. Antonio says only Medicare for all can bring manufacturing and jobs in general back to the USA and good paying, and useful jobs. Well, I don't think even that is enough. I think it helps, but also the Green New Deal, okay, is necessary. Kip Sullivan, yeah, Kip Sullivan, on why the Bernie Sanders bill is not single payer. I haven't read that. I have to read it. Kip Sullivan is one of the leading authorities in the country on Medicare for All. He's been writing about it forever, perhaps the last 15 or 20 years, okay, or more. He's a Minnesotan, and he's one of the people behind the push for single payer up there. He also wrote for a while for physicians for a national health program, okay, the PNHP, which is a leading organization in the nonprofit world in back, okay, of Medicare for All. And he's written some brilliant pieces, especially on the fight for healthcare reform in 2009 and 2010. He wrote some brilliant political pieces, which I relied very heavily on for my blogging at that particular time. Kip is just great. Antonio says no noise here. Zoltan Bexley has joined. Antonio says hi, Zoltan. And Steve says yep. And Steve says right, K. FDR2 wanted it. Yes, well, it was part of the Economic Bill of Rights, K, in a way. In other words, FDR stated the right to it, but he never got around to the legislation because he died first. In fact, he was ill even when he gave the radio address, okay, on the Economic Bill of Rights. And Barbara Werning says the average worker knows it will be better. We are being extorted. We are. The thieves have been getting us for ages and ages and ages. Joanne says to register and review your education to ensure you can vote. Joanne says Sanders is the only MMT candidate, even though he never mentions MMT in public. We know he's the only MMT candidate because he keeps his chief economic advisor around, and she's one of the 4 leading MMT people probably in the world right now. Steve says, and she's the most popular, okay, of the 4 in terms of writing for a popular audience. Oh, and by the way, she blogs, okay, at Bloomberg Opinion, which is interesting. Anyway, Steve Wolfbrand says, Bernie needs Tulsi as his VP. Her anti-war message would attract independents, okay, and libertarians, and even Republicans. Perhaps. Yeah, perhaps. I think certainly Tulsi would be a great asset in foreign policy area. But of course, if she's going to be running as the vice president, he's going to be balancing off the electoral advantages. But it's hard to see who he would pair up actually right now. And certainly Nina Turner is a possibility. And she'll be attacked for having too thin a record. Okay, as well as, probably other things for being too strident, but who cares about that? I don't think she's strident. I mean, I think she's fantastic. But they'll probably try to get her on her record only being a state senator and all. And, okay, Tulsi, they probably can't attack in this way. She had enough time in Congress and is distinguished enough that she can get by on her record. Okay, the question is whether, well, he's going to make oh, the assessment as to whether she would help him or hurt him at the polls. That's what's got to happen. I mean, from Bernie's point of view, this game is about him getting in office and continuing to build up the movement. Antonio says the problem is that the insurance health lines, the way they are, or anyway, so far, they are a huge subprime market. The uncovered are the homeless of healthcare. See what happened in 2008 with the housing market. It will be the same with healthcare. I'm not sure exactly what you mean there, Antonio. Oh, the health lines will be laden with cost and no people. That is a huge hoarding of capital. A steal. People lose insurance. They pocket the premium. People are paying to end up ripped off. Yes, you're right. It's a racket. Healthcare for profit is a racket. Russ points out that we already socialize risk and privatize the profits. Elaine says some states are taking people off the voter lists. I know. That's why we have to check our registrations. Kay says I need to call tomorrow and ask when I can expect my absentee ballot to come in the mail. SMH. This war on voting is very aggravating and tiresome. Yeah, maybe, well. Yes, California is sending many volunteers to Nevada, our neighbor. Yeah, I know. During which they'll also get some training for the great big fight in California, coming not too long after. In fact, already starting now. Joanne says workers' wages should rise with Medicare for all. Kay says union members out there will be voting for Medicare for all. I saw a post, from them today. If they're voting for Medicare for all, they got to vote for Bernie. He's the only one to vote for. And Kay says, Stephen Campbell's joined, and Kay says, well, I'm a tired old bag, so I'm out of here tonight. Looking forward to talking again soon. Thank you, Kay. Steve Zay, Sanders knows well how Congress's purse strings work. Advise with Stephanie Kelton. Yeah, I know. I know he does. Kay says, have a peaceful night. Evelina says, good night. Steve says, good night, Kay. Steve Day says, leadership fouling mainstream news, Kay. Yes, I know they've been fouling it. They're the owners, or they represent the owners. They do what the owners want them to do. Steve says, AOC will rip Michael Bloomberg a new one. Yeah, when she gets out on the trail and she talks about him and the stop and frisk policy, and having lived through the stop and frisk policy and what it cost people, in New York, that's going to make a difference out on the trail. And when it's between he and Bloomberg, she's going to tell that story everywhere she goes. She's going to tell stories about friends she knows. His apology is not accepted. And Steve says, $2, Chuck. Oh, Antonio keeps on listening to links. Oh, I'm sorry, Antonio. I forgot. Yeah, I forgot. You told me you were in Portugal. I should have remembered that you are in Portugal. And he says that Spain is a euphemism. And Elaine says that Bloomberg is a Republican still. Yeah, I agree. This apology is not accepted. Barbara Wernick says obscene. And Carmen Muniz has joined. And Richard Dean Winfield has joined. Hopefully he and I will get that interview going sometime next week. Hopefully I'll have the problem solved by then. Dale Weaver has joined. Steve Wolfbrand remarks, a big crowd tonight, Doc. Yeah. We may be growing. Susan Eldridge has joined. Evelina says at one point at 25. I didn't realize it was at 25. Steve says, yeah, Joe's show is growing. Spain is a euphemism. I'm in Portugal. I'm sorry. I won't make that mistake again. I'll say it 3 or 4 or 5 times tonight, Antonio. I won't make that mistake again. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to insult you. Ralph Sanders says hi. Hi, Ralph. Lana Dell says, I think Rashida would be awesome. But is she old enough? I think she probably is old enough. And she's a lawyer, too. Lana says, Tulsi won't carry on the progressive programs, though. But she's an economic illiterate. Well, she might be, but if she were running with Bernie, she'd have some mandatory lessons to take from Stephanie. So I don't think she would be an economic illiterate for long. And she does seem to be a progressive person in many ways. So we'd have to see. Anyway, I don't think Bernie would do a deal with her without certain conditions. Antonio is posting links to some of the articles that I linked in the description tonight. Antonio says, Portuguese, a real one. Antonio continues to post more articles. Russ says, I need to call it a night. See you again soon. Fine, Russ. Thank you very much for coming, as always. It's always great to see you here. And Antonio says, I like to help you with links and reading and listening. Multitasking is insanity. Antonio, you're quite right. And the help is much appreciated. There's no problem with people seeing the links twice. Steve says, I love Portugal. I visited a couple of years ago. Antonio says, Portugal is worse too. Worse than Spain or worse than the United States, Antonio? Well, I seem to be getting near the bottom of the comments, but right now my scroll bar is frozen. So Antonio shared the very last link I covered tonight. So here we are. We are at an end now. Okay, so American democracy is really in trouble. We need progressives. We need Bernie in the absolute worst way. We also need to quickly defeat the mayor, actually both mayors, and to disabuse the neoliberals of any hope that they would be able to win the nomination of the Democratic Party and also the race against Donald Trump in the fall. We have to make them understand that if they do not nominate Bernie Sanders, they guarantee a loss in the fall. None of them can win from Trump. None of them would be able to win from Trump. Too many skeletons in Mayor Bloomberg's closet. I think there are too many skeletons in Mayor Buttigieg's closet, too. It's bad. Anyway, I've been on for almost 2 hours now. So thank you for all your comments, and thank you for the shares. And thank you for coming. And I will see you next on Saturday night during the 9 o'clock hour. Tomorrow I will be, at least for some of the day, continuing to work on my sound problems to see if I can get them all resolved. They'll still be deviling me. Antonio says, yes, Portugal is good. The problem is the economy and the education system. Well, that's a big part of things. Barbara says, thank you, Joe. We need to win this. We need to win this in the worst way, Barbara. We really, really do. Okay, good night, all. See you Saturday.